Well, this is the most incredible honour, and not one that I could possibly have envisaged just a few years ago. Not one I envisaged at all. I only started doing literary translation, or got involved in literary translation, in 2012. Up until then, I spent a long time working mainly as a journalistic translator. I worked for about 14 years as a freelancer for the Goethe-Institut. I'm not sure whether the Goethe-Institut is aware of this. I was a translator and copy editor for a magazine called Fikr wa Fan, or Art and Thought in English, which unfortunately folded last year. My other work was for Deutsche Welle, still is partly for Deutsche Welle. I worked as an editor and journalist, and now as a translator for them. But getting into literary translation was something that came about, as I say, only about 5 years ago. I visited the British Centre for Literary Translation Summer School, where I met other literary translators, and it transformed my life. I was trying to work out what could make translation more interesting, because I quite enjoyed it, but it wasn't really something I felt passionate about. And someone had said to me, what do you feel passionate about? And I acting, which is what I did before, journalism, literature, that could be a way. And doing the BCLT summer school, meeting all these other literary translators, finding that passion for translation when it came to literature, that was what set me on this path. But although it's a tremendously supportive community, it is a tremendously supportive community, and I found that my colleagues, both at BCLT and in something called the Emerging Translators Network, or ETN, have been fantastic in helping me along. We all help each other along. We all give each other the support we need, and I would say they've been very much a part of what has put me on the path that's brought me here. I would like to thank very, very much from the bottom of my heart the Goethe-Institut. I'm getting a bit tearful. The jury of the Helen and Wolff Prize for awarding this to me. When I look at the other translators who were on the long list, the translators who've won this in the past, it's extraordinary to me to see myself on that list. I'd also like to thank Farrar, Straus Giroux, FSG in New York, and Laird Gallagher. Are you Laird? I recognize you. My editor, for entering the book for the prize. The publisher in the UK, Picador, and especially Kate Harvey, who edited the book beautifully, very delicately, and who believed in me enough to ask me to translate it, even though I'd never translated a novel before. This came about because she asked me to do the reader's report. She didn't read German, but was interested in the book. And when I read the book, and the reader's report took the form of a conversation over the phone, and she was saying, do you think we should buy it? I was like, you have to buy this book. It is amazing. Please, can I translate it? So that's sort of how it came about. I'd also like to thank Matthew Garrett, who created this beautiful cover for Picador. I think he really needs to be named, and his name needs to be known far and wide, because I'm sure that this cover is part of the reason why it's done so well. And I want to thank my Munich family who are here this evening to support me. It's through going to Germany, living in Munich, and then living in Cologne that I came to speak German. This brings me to something that I felt I really wanted to say, which has already been touched on by a couple of the speakers already. This is an important day, not just for me, obviously. I'm enjoying it being an important day for me, but it's an important day for many in America, for reasons we've just heard. It's an important day for my country. The British people have been voting in an election that will more or less decide on what terms we leave the European Union. That is a sentence that's very hard for me to say. I say my country, but I think of myself as European. I've always thought of myself as European. And it's very, very hard for me to consider the possibility, the probability that what I have always taken for granted, the freedom to move around Europe, the freedom to cross borders, the freedom to go and live and work in another country, as I did in Germany, that those freedoms might be rolled back, that the next generation may well not have them, that we will not have them anymore. As someone who clearly remembers 1989, the fall of the wall, the opening up of Eastern Europe, I find it quite extraordinary that just one generation later these walls are going up again, and not only in Europe. One of the reasons why I chose to study languages at school, I did English, French and German for my A-level school leaving exams, was because it was clear to me that these were languages that I was going to need to be able to speak other languages if I wanted to communicate with people, if I wanted to make connections with people beyond my immediate circle. I was desperate to get off the island, to go and cross the channel, which was not as easy in those days, and get to all those countries and cultures that were out there waiting to be discovered. I feel passionately that the learning of languages is tremendously important for breaking through these walls, for crossing these borders, for making these connections, for understanding other cultures. I think it's a tragedy that the learning of languages in the UK, I don't know what it's like in the States, but it's gone down. It's gone down through cuts, through lack of interest, through lack of support from successive governments. I understand that only 3,500 people in the whole of the UK did German A-level last year. And of course, not very many of those are actually going to go on to study it at university. That's not many people learning to speak German anymore. And it's the same for other languages. I think Spanish is doing better, but still, the interest in learning a foreign language now is going down and down. And I think it's part of the sense we're getting from our leaders, particularly, of drawing back, of shutting down, of going to this kind of spurious isolation, of not wanting to communicate, of not wanting to reach out to other people, to other cultures. And learning languages is so much a part of that, and so is reading translated fiction. I think that fiction has a fantastic role to play in this, and especially translated fiction, because when we read a book about another country, let's say, or another culture, or just another person, we enter into their head, we enter into their world, we are taken into their imagination, into their culture, into their feelings. We empathize with them. It creates a hook. We become that person when we're reading, at least I do. I don't know how you read, but when I'm immersed in a book, I become that person. I'm living their life through them. And because of that, I think fiction can do something that news or factual books can't do. We can learn from them, yes, but we can't actually live that life. When I think of books that I read growing up, I was transported to the Czech Republic, to France, to Italy, to Mexico. I had a little insight into that culture, and I became curious. Once you become curious, and once you have that hook, that little bit of insight, that little interest in another country, you see a report about it in the newspaper, you maybe read that report, not another one. And because of that, I want to see more fiction translated. I want to see more people getting hooked, getting drawn in. I think it's important, particularly now, that we read well, that we read wisely, and that we read translations. That said, I thank Robert Seethaler for writing this book. I completely fell in love with this book when I first read it, as I said, for the reader's report. I gather it quite often happens that translators say, I've read this book, it's my book, I have to translate it, and that is how I felt about this. Not only because it is a beautiful book, and for the reasons that I think most people who've read it have loved it and been moved by it. There are two particular things about it that resonated with me. I'll read you a little bit from it first, and then I'll explain why. For this. So this is near the end of the book. Once a week, Andreas Egger went down to the village to get matches and paint, or bread, onions, and butter. He had realized long ago that people there speculated about him. When he set off for home with his purchases on his homemade sledge, which he upgraded with little rubber wheels in spring, he would see them out of the corner of his eye, putting their heads together and starting to whisper behind his back. Then he would turn around and give them the blackest look of which he was capable. Yet in truth, he didn't much care about the villagers' opinions or their outrage. To them, he was just an old man who lived in a dugout, talked to himself, and crouched in a freezing cold mountain stream to wash every morning. As far as he was concerned, though, he'd done all right, and thus had every reason to be content. He would be able to live well for quite some time on the money from his tour guiding days. He had a roof over his head, slept in his own bed, and when he sat on his little stool outside the front door, he could let his gaze wander until his eyes closed and his chin sank onto his chest. In his life, he too, like all people, had harbored ideas and dreams. Some he'd fulfilled for himself. Some had been granted to him. Many things had remained out of reach, or barely had he reached them than they were torn from his hands again. But he was still here. And in the mornings after the first snow melt, when he walked across the dew-soaked meadow outside his hut and lay down on one of the flat rocks scattered there, the cool stone at his back and the first warm rays of sun on his face, he felt that many things had not gone so badly after all. According to his birth certificate, which in his opinion wasn't even worth the ink on the stamp, Egger lived to be 79 years old. He had held out longer than he himself had ever thought possible, and on the whole, he could be content. He had survived his childhood, a war, and an avalanche. He had never felt himself to be above doing any kind of work, had blasted an incalculable number of holes in rock, and had probably felled enough trees to heat the stoves of an entire town for a whole winter. Over and over again, he had hung his life on a thread between heaven and earth, and in his latter years as a tour guide, he had learned more about people than he was able fully to understand. As far as he knew, he had not burdened himself with any appreciable guilt, and he had never succumbed to the temptations of the world, to boozing, whoring, and gluttony. He had built a house, had slept in countless beds, stables, on the backs of trucks, and even a couple of nights in a Russian wooden crate. He had loved, and he had had an intimation of where love could lead. He had seen a couple of men walk about on the moon. He had never felt compelled to believe in God, and he wasn't afraid of death. He couldn't remember where he had come from, and ultimately he didn't know where he would go. But he could look back without regret on the time in between, his life, with a full-throated laugh and utter amazement. I think what Robert does so beautifully is the description of detail. To me, Andreas Egger is the epitome of mindfulness. He looks at things, he really sees them. He sees the dew on the grass. He sees a knife and the sharpness of the blade. He sees the mountains cut out like a stencil against the sky. He sees the detail. That meant a lot to me because the reason why I changed direction in my career was because I had to stop doing what I had been doing, a lot of the journalism and the acting, because I became very ill and I spent almost a year in hospital and recovering. In that time, I spent a lot of time in a hospital room, then at home, not able to walk very far, and not knowing whether I would really recover. When I went outside on crutches, walking along the road, I remember looking at a flower and seeing a bird and seeing them with new eyes, with completely different eyes. And that's what this book did for me. The other thing about this book is that there's a lot of death in it. And some people found that disturbing, upsetting, depressing even. I found it tremendously comforting. I found it uplifting. What Robert does in this book is present death as part of life. It's part of the natural world. It's not something that's suddenly there, that you're suddenly confronted with. It's always there. It's always with us. It's always with Andreas. When he reaches the end, he knows that he's lived his life, and now his death is coming, just as everybody's death is coming. But that in between, he's lived this life of moments, that life is just one moment after another. They might be big moments or small moments, but everyone is precious. And I think what this book, and I hope I achieved this in the translation, what this book transmits is that joy in life, the extraordinariness of any ordinary life, any moment in that life. And that what we have to do is live each moment and observe each moment and cherish each moment. And that's certainly what I'm doing today. Thank you.